Now I'll take this opportunity to introduce our first keynote speaker for this inaugural event. We have with us Dr. Saurabh Garg. Dr. Garg is an alumnus of IIT Delhi and IIM Ahmedabad. He is a 1991 batch IAS officer from the Odisha Cadre. He has had multiple stints in the government of India, in addition to, of course, working in the Odisha government. He was in the Ministry of Finance earlier, and before his current role, he was a Principal Secretary Agriculture in the government of Odisha, where we had an opportunity to work closely with him. He is a reform champion. In his stint in agriculture in Odisha, he redid the state's agriculture policy, Samriddhi, came up, conceptualized, and implemented something called Kalia, which was a counter narrative to farm loan waivers at the time. He really overhauled the way the agriculture department and the state functions, made it extremely data-backed, introduced data-backed performance management in the government, and many other reforms. And now last year, he joined Aadhaar as the CEO of the Unique Identification Authority of India, and is really driving a whole set of reforms there, including overseeing how to expand the usage of Aadhaar across the country. So somebody who really understands governance, understands technology, and how to bring the best of both together to deliver outcomes at scale. So one of the foremost GovTech leaders in the country. A pleasure to welcome you, Dr. Garg, and really looking forward to your keynote. And we'll have Dr. Garg talk to us for the next 20 odd minutes, and then request everyone to write their questions in the chat window. They'll be curated, and I'll be kind of asking the questions on behalf of the audience to Dr. Garg post the keynote. Thank you. Over to you, Dr.
Garg. Good afternoon, and thank you, Gaurav, for this warm introduction, and great to be here on this Code for GovTech event. And I must compliment you and the entire Samagra team for conceptualizing this and bringing it at this level today. It's always been a pleasure to work with you and your team, and look forward to some continuing contributions from different people who are interested in this sector of how technology can work for governance and government. Just to give a introduction, I think when we are talking about governance, there are various aspects to it. There are issues of center and state, and state to state, and state and local government. And then obviously the focal point of all programs is the citizen at the center of everything, what any level of government that may do, or the different arms of the administrative machinery may do. And some of the areas of governance which we need to keep in view, or very often the issue is what is the metric that one can use to measure good governance, if I may put it that way. And I would probably put 5 or 6 measures, and then we can talk of how technology can help in that. So first is obviously reach and accessibility. Whenever we talk of any government delivery program, the foremost issue is whether it's going to be able to be accessible by all, or as we call it, to be scaled to population level. So the reach of the programs obviously defines the very basics of how successful a government program would be. The second I would put is on the ability to respond and proactively make dynamic changes in the implementation or the conceptualization of the program. Because while it's always desirable to run pilots, but very often one is not always able to run pilots. And while conceptualizing, we have to look at it, but I think the ability to be able to make quickly respond to changes that may be necessary also becomes very important. The third point I would want to emphasize is on the issue of transparency. I think that is one thing in the government. It's any program. It's extremely critical to prevent any kind of misgivings with anyone. So how transparent we are in the implementation of the program, that would also be a metric which would determine the success of any program or delivery of service. The fourth point I would mention is on the accountability, because there has to be a defined responsibility matrix, which clearly sets out what's the who is responsible for what and what's the accountability mechanisms. And this is especially important because in the government, it's not the so to say the market which is defining that accountability. It's always post-mortem kind of audits that are done, or the programs are reviewed subsequently, and that's why it's very important to build in that accountability systems. And last but not the least, I would say, is the resilience to be able to manage unforeseen challenges. So how important are the systems that have been built in are resilient to look at it. So I'm just defining these 5-6 terms to be used, that whenever we use technology for governance, we would need to take into account that these issues have been in a way built into whatever we are coding or whatever we are developing or whatever we are delivering through the basis of technology. Increasingly, a number of programs have developed a citizen charter, which is also helps two ways, both in terms of building trust, which is extremely necessary, because I think credibility is one thing which everyone expects from the government, and in fact assumes that it's there, and therefore we need to build on it. And the second, as I mentioned earlier, was on the transparency part. So I'll just give you some examples of programs which have used technology in the past, and that will give an idea of what kind of work is possible and can be done. And some of them are at the center level, and some of them at the state level. But before I get into specific programs, there's always this question of a digital divide, that supposing we implement a program using technology, we need to take into account that what or how would people be able to access who do not have access to technology, who do not have access to infrastructure, who do not have access to connectivity. So that's an important part, and therefore there's always the issue of how much hybridization, if I can put it that way, of the program has to be there. Though you have BharatNet and PM Vani, which are looking at high-speed public internet access to bridge this digital divide, and BharatNet has reached a stage that nearly each of the 6 lakh villages or 6.5 lakh villages in the country have access to an optical fiber, but there might be issues of last mile connectivity. But along with the BharatNet, you have the citizen service centers, the CSCs, where are more than 5 lakh of them. So even if a person doesn't have their own computer or a smartphone, they would perhaps have access to a CSC or a cyber cafe, which is very close by. And then you have a host of platforms that are being built, like the National Knowledge Network and the India Stack, which really comprises a host of programs, which I'll just shortly maybe mention, or I think my colleagues would be. To talk about some of the programs which have used technology extensively. First of all, I would like to mention the PFMS, the Public Financial Management System, which in a way is transforming the way funds are being sent from the center to the states to the local governments and down to the, by use of technology, and how tracking is possible, how parking of funds is no longer an option, and how it is improving transparency, accountability, and usage of funds. So PFMS, I would say, is a great platform which has been developed entirely on technology. Then you have a host of government delivery programs, which broadly can fall under the DBT framework, the direct benefits transfer. So whether it's a PM Kisan, which Gaurav was mentioning, what Kalia and Raitu Bandhu had done earlier, and then got transformed at the national level at PM Kisan. You have the Pahel program, the LPG transfer, which was again on the DBT principles, moving on that. And then you have the fertilizer programs being developed, which will hopefully look at how fertilizer and the PDS program, for example, that is something which is using technology to be able to ensure that there's no duplication in ghost beneficiaries, by the fact that each of the ration shops of nearly more than 1 lakh of them across the country are using the Aadhaar digital rails to ensure that the foodstuffs are delivered to the right people. And then you have recently the eShram platform, where laborers have been onboarded onto the system so that benefits can be given to labor. And the origin of this was the migrant labor problem that we witnessed at the onset of COVID in 2020, when large number of migrant labor went back to their homes, and the problems were being seen on how to assist them. And based on that, we have now come to a stage of one nation, one ration card, where you might be having a ration card in somewhere in West Bengal, but if 3 members of the family are in your home village and 2 members are working in Bombay, 2 members can draw their rations from here and 3 people can draw their rations from there. And I think that's a great way of how technology has helped people. And it's that focus, I would say, which is what Aadhaar's focus is also. We are developing our Aadhaar 2.0. And the basis of that is to look at how the Aadhaar platform can be a participant in the ease of living of residents. I think that is what is the overall defining vision of the platform. And I would perhaps think that should be the overall vision of using technology for governance on how it can help the ease of living at the bottom of the pyramid. If that is what is being achieved, I'm sure a lot of other things automatically fall into place. And that's why you have the DigiLocker, you have the Umang platform, you have the UPI, which will work on the feature phones. And we need to be cognizant of the fact that while 80 crore smartphones are there in the country, that still means that 40 crore people don't have smartphones. And at the same time, while 90% of the people have connectivity, there is still maybe 5 or 10% where connectivity problems are there. So whenever we talk about technology for governance, and that's the issue about scaling up or with government, that 99% is not good enough. That 1% for a country like India is still too much to be left out. So we have to have a solution which takes care of universality. And I think that's what needs to be at the bedrock of all programs. So lastly, I would just say that we have a lot of new technologies of AI, ML, blockchain, etc. And many of the problems would get solved by using these more extensively. And I'm sure the young engineers who are participating in this are much more familiar with this than we are, and look forward to the kind of work that you would do. I would just say that last year, UIDAI itself organized a hackathon, and we were amazed at the kind of response to that and the kind of solutions that the young students came with. Some of them we've taken in on as interns also in our organization. So I'm sure every government department is working on this. You have the Smart India Hackathon, which does across all departments, problem statements across all departments. So I'm sure this initiative of Code for GovTech adds to the entire ecosystem that's developing of people looking at broader issues, societal issues, and how they can participate in nation building. So once again, welcome all the contributors. My compliments to all the organizers and all the supporters for this program. And I do look forward to this program only expanding as we go ahead. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Dr. Garg, for your introductory remarks. Questions are coming to us from different sources, and I just request everyone to keep sending them. We're curating them in the back end, and then I'll be asking some of them, as many as possible, to Dr. Garg. Doctor, I'll start by, you talked about technology for ease of living, right? Technology for easing things out for the citizens. And you talked about different examples of places where technology has been used at scale. If you were to look forward, what are some of the upcoming government programs that really you believe will solve for ease of living for the citizen and use technology, or some of the programs that you wish would come in the coming years, or some problem statements that can potentially get solved through technology in the coming years that will contribute to ease of living?
See, at the moment, just looking at the DBT and Aadhaar, which are using Aadhaar, which obviously becomes very often the basis for many of the using technology. We have nearly 1,000 odd programs of the central government, more than 300, and more than 650 of the different state governments. And the kind of uses that has been used is amazing. I mentioned a few of PM Kisan, whether it's for attendance across various areas, or to verify any kind of benefit that is being given. So that's one area that increasingly a look is being done at every government service, and to see how, or if not fully, what portion of that can use technology. And this exercise is going, for example, we are looking at the births and deaths registration, and how that can use technology to ensure that a lot of the systems can capture a person's birth and then automatically enroll that person in different programs. And at the same time, as and when a person expires, automatically that should take care of in the different systems, so that there is, and these kind of small things would make a lot of difference, one on the benefit at the birth and prevention of leakage in terms of death. The other area where a lot of work has already been done is the fintech sector. We've done a lot of work on the banking side, but I think where a lot of growth will happen is on the banking, is perhaps the first kind of service on the financial service, but you have micro insurance, you have micro pension, you have micro investments. So while the number of bank accounts in the country are around more than 140 crore, which for a population of 133 crore seems very reasonable. But if you look at the number of investors, that's hardly 5 or 6 crores. So that's an area where how to bring in more people on investments. And that would also mean that people to look at investments other than the brick and mortar investments that they are familiar with. Similarly, if you look at the pensions, it's still in 2 digits, low 2 digits, somewhere around 20 crores. And micro insurance is also. So, I mean, this in the fintech sector is another area where a lot of work would happen. And then you have, of course, you mentioned about the health sector and the education where scholarships are being used. So, and others would be a lot of other APIs that can be developed and used by the private sector. I think we've not even touched the surface on that, and I think a lot of work will happen out there.
No, that's very helpful, Dr. Garg. And I'll just pick on the thread that you mentioned in the end, which is the private sector and opening up the APIs for them to build a lot of solutions. A lot of the people on this webinar, Dr. Garg, are not from the government. There are two categories. One is from a set of people from the ecosystem that has come up in the last few years, which is working on GovTech and working very closely with the governments. And then you have a lot of young talent from across the country, which is wanting to contribute to this. Now, how do you see the participation of the private sector or the private contributors, private folks, or the whole question around PPP when it comes to GovTech in the coming, let's say, decade or so? How do you see that evolving?
Uh, See, a lot of the work that would need to be done for mainstreaming technology in government service delivery will need to come from the private sector, because though you have organizations within the government, and the NIC, I would say, is the National Informatics Center, is the primary, so to say, organization which does a lot of the work, given that it's operating even at the district levels and at the state level. But at the same time, the level of requirement of technology is so much more that it's not possible for any one organization to be able to do it. And it will operate at different levels. One is obviously in terms of developing APIs and software applications which can be used by citizens to access maybe databases or different services. The second would be, and where I think a lot more work would happen, is exploiting the space and satellite technologies for GIS and GPS based services, which I think we've just scratched the surface on that, and how that can be used. And apart from this would be, which would be episodic, I would say. For example, whenever there are disasters, or there are such kind of or festivals and melas which happen, which require high level of mobilization in a short time, where a lot of technology would be able to help. And there, I think it's the private sector which can really scale up and implement it. I think the main problem that where a lot of issues come around is the processes that the government needs to follow to be able to onboard a private sector player. And I think that's the biggest bugbear, if I would say, in this entire process. Otherwise, it would be a lot more easier. And I think the GEM platform is something which is really helping in that, because it is taking care of a lot of the procurement issues which traditionally prevented more active private participation. So I'm sure as we move ahead, we will be able to work out on what should be the mechanisms for bringing in. I don't think there's a issue of need of the private sector. I think a lot of issues where we need to resolve are the mechanisms that we need to bring them on board.
Yeah. So more than the why and the what, it's more about the how when
Absolutely.
it comes to the private sector participation. Let me shift gears and pick a question from one of the participants, Nilesh Sharma. He's asking, is India looking to use blockchain and crypto for better transparency?
See, I mean, a short question would be yes, but I think a short answer, sorry, would be yes. But I think at the moment, both blockchain and crypto are yet to really, what should I say, stabilize and what are the benefits that they would offer. So blockchain potentially seems to have a lot of benefits, but I think the use cases are still being developed, and how those use cases would take care of what should I say, I mean, for example, whenever the government does something, there's always a final approval authority. In a blockchain, it's much more decentralized. So what are the kind of areas where you don't require, where the approval mechanisms can be decentralized and you don't need a formal authority to do it? And I think those are the kind of, and in crypto, of course, there are, I think on the cryptocurrency part, there are enough discussions, and the Reserve Bank of India has made clear what their views are on it. So I think Blockchain as a technology, I would say, is something which offers a lot of potential. The biggest use case of blockchain is presently crypto or cryptocurrency, which may not be something which the governments are very comfortable with. So blockchain, where it can be used in other places, land records is one example that has been given. But I think there needs to be a proof of concept and more work done before we are able to really determine where it will make a benefit.
Sounds good. Doctor, let me build on a question that Aditya Chopra is asking in the chat window. We have the National Digital Education Architecture when it comes to education. We have the Ayushman Bharat Digital Mission now in case of health. We have the IDEA stack that is being talked about for agriculture. Now, these are all frameworks and provide some kind of a directional pathway for the different sectors. But to really make them concrete, to make them translate into tangible outcomes on the ground, how do you see that happening over the next 5 to 10 years? How easy or difficult is that going to be? Because these are complex sectors. And while it's one thing to put down a policy framework for it, but it's a very different thing to kind of really actualize the benefits on the ground. How do you see that playing out?
See, on each of these areas, whether it's health, whether it's education, whether it's labor, whether it's agriculture, for the government, each of these sectors are extremely critical because the delivery of services and what the citizens get is dependent on that. So while the overall overarching framework is what these programs or platforms are talking about, my sense is that specifics within this is where the work will actually happen. So for example, the PM Kisan is a program which is in the agriculture sector, and that's taken off faster, and that's being implemented using a host of technology inputs. So, and this is what will happen, that wherever there is a pain point or wherever there is a need felt for immediate implementation, that program or that scheme will progress much faster. But the very fact that you have at the back end an overarching architecture, so to say, so each of these schemes that will be implemented would ultimately need to fall as a part of that architecture which is there. So in the education sector, the first thing that's being started off are the scholarships. So you're building on that, and then a lot of other things will follow in. And I think it will be a combination of this. And it's very necessary to have that broader vision at the back of the mind to ensure 5 years later, you are able to tie it on all together.
All right. Dr. Garg, the next question, again, coming from one of the participants is on open source. So the question is that while there's an ecosystem now emerging, a private ecosystem, which is very gung-ho about open source, digital public goods, and so on, and we hear a lot of policy, almost mandates is a stronger word, policy inclination on part of the government of India to use open source and so on. But when it comes to the ground, when it comes to, let's say, the states, when it comes to municipal corporations and so on, the reality is that a lot of time there are custom solutions that get built which serve the here and now objectives of the tech transformation, but there's no real incentive to contribute to a larger DPGs and open source ecosystem. Right, the incentives somewhere are not that aligned, or there's not enough capacity there of service providers to be able to do that. So how do you see this being overcome in the coming years, and how do you really accelerate this ecosystem?
Yeah, absolutely. And to that, I would also add an understanding of the open system network apart. So no doubt when you are in government, as it always happens, that you want things to have been implemented yesterday. And therefore, a ready-made solution which is marketed by some company becomes the easiest method for implementation in the short run. And I think that's where this platforms that we talked about on these ideas architecture or the education NDR architecture. So that's where they come in, so that there is a clear thinking that in the medium term, we need to be open source, but there would perhaps be short-term solutions which may not be open source, which will get implemented. But in a way, implementation of those kind of short-term solutions through branded products also opens the way to ensuring that those services are delivered on the technology platform. Then shifting from an MS SQL to a MySQL is a much simpler job than shifting from paper and pen to an MS SQL. So I think that initial job, which perhaps the large private sector marketing can open those hesitancy, if I can put it that way. I think it's a small price to pay, given the fact that the overall architecture and the overall vision remains that we move to open source in the medium term.
Coming, Dr. Garg, now to your current role as CEO of Aadhaar, how do you see Aadhaar or UIDAI evolve over the last decade or so? And what's in store for the future now that you're steering the ship?
Yeah, see, the last decade has seen, we have reached a stage where every person in India, every resident, every citizen, adult at least, has an Aadhaar. We've reached 100% saturation of adult Indians, and even in the 0 to 18, by the time it's age 5, it's more than 92%. So we have done the, I would say, the basic work of having the digital rails in place. And it's the next 10 years, while it would continue to improve those systems, improve the technology, improve the credibility and the security and privacy issues, where there will be no doubt incremental work, and even perhaps in some of those evolutionary work in authentication. Where we see the role and where the next 10 years would move the country is how we can leverage this Aadhaar to be able to transform the way services are delivered. And I think PM Kisan is a prime example of such a delivery, where you could not have thought that in a period of 2 months, you can deliver funds to 10 crore farmers from scratch. Normally, these kind of programs took 5 years, 10 years to develop. The PDS, for example, the procurement operations started sometime in the 70s, and they were reached saturation level 30 years later. So I think the way you can implement programs, and I think that also in a way meets the aspirations of the people who want immediate implementation of whatever is being talked about. And I think the next 10 years would see the implementation speed and the ability to even think of programs and schemes which you could not even have thought of 20 years back. I think the next 10 years are going to see that in the government space, and I'm hopeful that even in the private space, it will be seen. So literally, and not just figuratively, it would be on the ease of living of residents. I think that is really going to be where the next 10 years of Aadhaar would transform the lives of people.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Garg, for taking these questions. And it's always wonderful to listen to your perspective. And we couldn't have hoped for anyone better to kick off the inaugural edition of Code for GovTech.